That isolation term sure causes problems. I've mentioned one already, which is properly called geographic isolation. All it means is that among members of the same species, different subpopulations now have either reduced or lack opportunity to breed across some kind of boundary. Sometimes the boundary could just be distance. You have a group of creatures who have wandered over into somewhat more distant territory, and perhaps, in fact, there are still breeding events, reproductive events across the whole range, but they're very much rarer between these identifiable geographic portions. Perhaps the wandering can be so severe as to actually be a clean break in geographic terms, as I mentioned with islands. Geographic isolation is not in and of itself speciation. It is merely empirically, as far as we can tell, the primary context for speciation. What about the speciation itself? And that's where this term reproductive isolation comes into play. Again, this is wrapped up with what Meyer called the biological species concept, which, as it happens, doesn't seem to be correct. However, we've been saddled with the persistence of that concept and of these following concepts, which I prefer to call into question. The idea being that speciation is done or happens at a magical moment of, hey, this guy, those guys, they can't interbreed anymore. Looking for that magical moment has led people to look at the various incapabilities of interbreeding among many different species to see what they can find, as if those were models for the long ago or for other speciation events. This gets confounded with the idea, too, that a new species is a product of highly directed selection. It's in a new place, it must need to be different now, and selection takes care of this problem for it. That mode or context for talking about selection isn't particularly rigorous in the first place. Furthermore, it leads to the difficult claim, which goes all the way back to Wallace in the 19th century, that species are selected to avoid miscegenation. I find this kind of an interesting idea in pure selective technical terms because why not? Selection against so-called miscegenation would imply less potential breeding partners. It only seems to work given the assumption that species are themselves somehow pure entities and that miscegenation can lead to nothing good. This has led 20th century biologists to say, well, there must be hybrid disadvantage. That if you have two species and they can hybridize, then there must be selection against the hybrids. Therefore, once barriers to reproduction have evolved into place, now, click, we have completed the speciation process. I argue that this is a humpbacked argument from the beginning. On the one hand, again, we see widespread hybridizing across living things. And if somebody is going to claim that there is a hybrid disadvantage, then show me the money. On a case-by-case basis, there may be one, fine, but to actually latch onto this as a principle of speciation at a general level, the evidence for that is nil. One of the interesting case studies would be looking at mules, the famous offspring of donkeys and horses who are themselves sterile. One would imagine, if we're talking about selection's need to do this and need to do that, that selection to produce fertile mules would be vastly more selectively advantageous then selection, presumably, to cancel their existence and shift from what they call a post-zygotic mating barrier to a pre-zygotic mating barrier. We don't see anything of the sort, obviously. There doesn't seem to be selection against making mules, and there doesn't seem to be selection for making mules. And we also really just don't have to stick with this idea that there is this magical click moment of speciation in which all of a sudden reproductive incompatibility is clinched. After all, if we're talking about different species having different ecological, physiological, behavioral features such that we look at them and say different things, then what does reproductive compatibility have to do with it? The terminology is a little stuck. Whether speciation results in reproductive incompatibility or whether it encounters reproductive incompatibility and thus now we have species. I won't go around and around the merry-go-round of trying to resolve that. All I have to do is look around at the world itself and see all these sister species interbreeding on and off opportunistically throughout the world, and we can simply cancel that whole idea and say that reproductive isolation, in terms of the capacities of the creatures themselves, is certainly a predictable outcome once we have several different speciation events worth of comparison to consider, but not as an intrinsic or required element of speciation itself.